for this presentation, it really came from a lot of recent requests and job postings that I've seen, or more like, I guess, consulting project postings that I've seen, where it seems like data is something that people are now aware of, and they realize that there are ways to get it free out on the internet, or sometimes you have to have some sort of a membership, or pay to log into the site or something like that. But rather than rely on whatever a site or a provider has, sometimes it's easier to just scrape and not use their their interface. And so that's really where this presentation comes from, is looking at the different options that you have. So if you're in a situation where you want to, or you need to scrape data, then you may have something in your mind that is scraping that is not as simple as the solution that you do have available. And so that's where I figured we would take this one. And some of this is going to be, starting with an overview, but we're going to talk about some data sources like APIs, actually scraping off of web pages, RSS feeds, very similar to APIs, and then sort of wrap up with some tricks, tips, and trip ups, sort of the things that you need to think about if you're going to jump into some sort of a scraping project. So in general, a lot of times people think of scraping as back to the old school, trying to find a way to get data off of mainframes and get that into some sort of modern database. And that was what was done, was called scraping. And what you would do is you would have something that would log in, and then based on it, go into the display, go, X characters over, Y characters down, pull that, and then suck that into a database. And it included things like, with scraping, it's usually, you can essentially the equivalent of like a screenshot. So you're pulling data off the screen, and then you're parsing that and then pushing it somewhere. But also a lot of times it includes interaction. So you're entering data, you're clicking buttons, often seen with like some of the web crawling and things like that as well, or spidering a website is often going to be, go sort of hand in hand with the idea of scraping. But the goal of it really is a scraping project, or doing that functionality. You're really just making use of, usually it's publicly available data. Sometimes it's something that's, behind some sort of a paywall, but it's still using somebody else's data and sourcing that in a way that you can use it. If you think of yourself maybe even as a clearinghouse of data, that you can go in, you can format, you can do some sort of manipulations of it, calculations based on it, group it, you name it. But now you're taking all this data and repurposing it, essentially. Usually, or sometimes you'll find that you can actually have multiple sources. So you may be validating data, or maybe it's, maybe it's regional or something like that. So you get slightly different data from these various sources, and you're finding some way to sort of merge those in. A lot of times you're going to have different formats. Your target is, your database, your data warehouse, but the format of the data and even the consistency of the data that you pull in can be very different. In some cases, for example, in some cases you may get an entire address in city, state, and zip, and in others you get, maybe just a name or a street or something like that, or maybe just a zip code. A good example to think of for the multiple formats is, think about if you've ever gone out to job sites, particularly like, surf 3 or 4 of them. If you look at a monster.com versus prgjobs.com or indeed.com or ladders.com, all of these sites effectively have job data, but it's going to be different. Some will have different levels of descriptions, they'll have different categories, all kinds of things like that. Some will tell you who the customer is or who the company is, some won't. So all of those are going to be multiple formats. Like I said, your goal is that you're going to repurpose this for whatever your solution happens to be. And let's just take like if it's the job example. So maybe you want a site that allows people to just see what's out there, all of the let's say, medical healthcare related jobs. So you could go to all of these different sites and essentially scrape data off of them, depending on how they're set up, but basically go scrape their data. And instead of people having to go to all those sites and do, searches across all of them, you are basically doing the search for them, taking the results, and then, you can repurpose it, reformat it, do it in a way that's consistent so they can more easily do apples to apples comparisons, and then provide that for your users. So a lot of it is the ability maybe to share data that otherwise would be very difficult to share, or to just provide easier access. Particularly if you're talking about a lot of different data sources, it can be a pain to go out to 10 different places. And there's definitely something, there's a value for not having to do that, to be able to come to one place and see all that data. If you think of RSS feed readers, those apps, that's exactly what it does. Is it just says, instead of you having to go look at all these feeds and then, go to these sites and read their articles, then we'll just go hit all of these RSS feeds. We'll pull those articles in, and then you can read them in one easy place. So that's sort of a summary, sort of what scraping looks like. So when you talk about ways, and this goes back to the many data sources, probably the easiest way to pull data is via APIs. If you have data sources that provide an application programming interface, an API, then you can get a lot of data that's going to be structured, that's going to be clean. You usually can do a lot of filtering and send parameters into the query to sort of limit stuff to what matters to you. Now, with an API, it may be public, so it may just be a matter of hitting an address and it's going to kick some information back. You may need some sort of an access key or authentication. That is definitely not uncommon these days, particularly for a lot of cloud-based software. They do have APIs, but they also require you to have at least some sort of access key or a developer key. And that's really so people don't just, crush their systems with requests. With an API, once you've got that key, then it's what are the parameters? What is the data that you want to use? Most of these are going to be documented, sometimes in very solid documentation. So let's see, I don't know if I've got one up. Let's see. There. Do a quick apologies, because I didn't think about this till just now, but I may have one. Let's see. Yeah, let's see. Is this going to give me a, yeah. So you may see stuff like this, as you can see some pretty solid documentation about APIs. So this would be things like, what's your call? You can see what are the parameters, which is, maybe I don't want to bring everything in. Maybe I only want to, do data for the last month, or maybe I want to do only data since the last time I made a call. And then you're going to see nice formatted stuff. So you're going to see column names, you're going to see data types, things like that, that make it fairly clean and easy to use an API, because then it's just a matter of, essentially it's just simple data mapping at that point. You know what you're getting in from the API, and then where do you want to store that? But with an API, because of how they're set up, you're going to want to think about your frequency. How often are you going to need to do a call? Do you need to do data? Do you need to update it essentially real time? So like every 5 minutes? Do you need to do it once an hour? Do you need to do it once a day? Do you need to do it once a week? That kind of stuff's going to vary quite a bit. When you think of, again, thinking of an example of job sites, you may want to do that every hour so that there's fresh jobs showing up and bring people back. But maybe, your customers are only typically going to do, they're only typically going to be looking for jobs maybe on the weekend. And so then maybe only do it like, once or twice a week, maybe every, Friday or maybe Thursday night, you go out and get all the latest stuff. And then that's, that covers you for the next week. The work of most APIs, it's connecting is usually pretty easy. So then it really comes down to mapping the results, deciding which of the data that the API provides you that you need, and then mapping that into places to store it in your database. Now, sometimes it may be, we'll call it like child data or related data. So you may have to make a call, pull all your data in, and then there may be some sort of like an ID that you're going to have to go back and use that list of IDs to make additional calls to get more information. So for example, let's say you've got companies that you're pulling information in on, and each of those, when you call the companies, they have a primary contact, but that's basically all they have is just have like, and maybe it's a name and an ID, but also within the API, they have a way to get contact information like a address and email and phone and things like that. So in that case, you may have to do a multi-pass where you would first get all of the companies, store all that information wherever you need to, and then go back for all of those contact IDs, make calls, or a call and then match the contact IDs depending on how it works, to make sure you store your data and the relationships within those. And that means sometimes you're going to have to do, you may have to do some lookups or some sort of an ID caching or something like that, because you'll have, for example, let's say you're bringing companies in and you've just got a site that's displaying company information. Well, when that data updates, then you want to make sure that instead of on your subsequent call, instead of creating yet another customer record, you want to be able to know what is that ID so I can go update the correct data in my system. And particularly if you're doing multiple systems, multiple data sources, then you're going to want to have some way to know what was that data source, what was the ID in that system, and then you're going to separately have your own ID within your system. So you're going to have to be able to map that in some way. And you may do that again. You may have to do that by like pulling a bunch of data, caching a list of IDs or something like that, and then making calls based on that, or using that to do sort of on the fly mappings. Or you may do it by like storing data source and external ID, things of that nature. But APIs give us, the key is APIs give us the cleanest, typically the cleanest way to get our data. Now, scraping is going to be a little more challenging because this is where we're going to be going out to a website and pulling data. So for an example, maybe I want to go to the Developerpreneur site and look at the blog. And maybe I want to go through here and I want to have a scraper that goes through, and I want to go to this site and I want to pull all the content, basically all the titles, maybe the date it was posted, that kind of information, maybe the category. And there's a lot of that you can get because you could get it from either scraping. We actually have, in this case, you can do an RSS feed, but it may be something where that doesn't exist, where there is no RSS feed. So you end up having to go in and scrape, which means you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to look into this, looking at the source, you're going to have to go in and find a way to navigate down into that source to say, oh, okay, I want this, for me to get this title, which is probably hard to see, I'm going to have to go in and get this little link here, and I'm going to have to get the text out of this, this anchor. So it can be challenging, but you can get it exactly, if you need to, usually exactly how a database has it. So usually that's going to involve, with scraping, that's going to be some sort of a home page or maybe even a login that you're going to have to do. And this is going to be automated through something like, a lot of times through like Selenium, or Selenium gives you an easy way to record and then generate code to do these things. But you also can, use whatever your language of choice is, whether it's Java or Python or Ruby or whatever. As long as it can do a post, then you can post out to the site, bring the information back, and then with the resulting data, you can start walking through it. Now, with that, you're probably going to need some sort of keys or IDs or path. We've mentioned before things like I can take something, I think I can go from here and I can do, let's see, that's what, oh, it's here. Maybe. Yeah, here we go. So here I can copy, like, we have selector paths and X paths, but if I take that X path and let me just go here, it looks something like this. It's not the easiest thing, but it is a way to get you based on like an ID. It's going to get me to where I need to go. Now, this is not going to be really useful, this specific example, because the IDs are going to change. So you're going to have a way to walk through all of this structure, whatever that is. So what is that? That's probably a post. That's a post loop. So yeah, everything that's a list post, you're going to have to get all that kind of stuff. So it can be time consuming, but it also doesn't require the customer to provide you much. So you're going to go in, you're going to figure out what your IDs are, what your path is, what data are you going to pull. A lot of times you're going to have to repeat that because there's going to be lists of data on your site that you're scraping. You're probably going to have to do some link navigating. Like in this case, if I wanted to get more information, I would have to click on the link and then pull like the full data. I would have to pull it there.